Yes, guys, I'm currently in Pelsall, and that is the old station there, believe it or not. The pub, anyway. Anyway, regardless of all that, I've got a story about the old Pelsall Hall Colliery Disaster. Yeah, pits got flooded from an old workings and then ended up taking the lives of 22 people, I think it was. Maybe 23. I'm not too sure. Either way, we'll find out. So, let's get into it. Just a heads up as well, if you live at the building that used to be the Station Inn, on Station Road I think it is, in Pelsall, don't let your kids watch this video. I've always been quite conscious about, like, I said to someone a couple of months ago, like, imagine watching one of my videos and then realising that your house used to be used as a morgue. Do you know what I mean? Well, your house on Station Road was used as a morgue. So, yeah, like I say, don't let your little ones watch this video. Anyway, let's get into it, guys.
On the morning of the 14th of November 1872, 33 men and boys went underground at Pelsall Hall Colliery, and before the day was over, 22 of them would be trapped inside the mine. None of those 22 men and boys would ever return home alive, and the disaster that followed would become one of the darkest events in the history of Pelsall. The disaster was not caused by fire or explosion, as so many 19th century mining disasters were. Instead, it began with water that had been hidden for years inside a forgotten network of underground workings, which didn't appear on the available plans and which the men working at Pelsall Hall had no reason to believe were nearby. The colliery was operated by Morgan and Starkey, and the miners believed they were working through what was known as maiden ground, meaning coal that had never previously been disturbed. The pit was around 50 yards deep, while the highest parts of the workings rose some 12 or 13 yards above from the bottom of the shaft. The underground roads had been surveyed only the day before the disaster. Richard Griffiths, the assistant surveyor, later explained that the heading where the accident began had appeared drier than usual, and nothing in the condition of the mine, the plans or the land above, suggested that the abandoned roadway filled with water was lying immediately ahead. Michael Cash was working in a heading near the edge of the known workings. He was 46 years old and was accustomed to driving roadways forward through the coal. While approximately 30 yards away, another miner named Harry Asprey was working in a separate part of the mine. A short time before breakfast, Cash called Asprey over and said, "Over here, Harry, come and see the River Dee." When Harry reached him, he found water coming in from the coal in two separate streams. The larger stream was close to the floor and was described as being about as thick as a man's leg, while the second and smaller stream was coming through around 6 inches above. Now, water was a familiar presence in coal mines, and Asprey had seen it dripping from roofs and running along underground roads many times before. Even so, this particular flow troubled him enough to tell Cash that he wouldn't be cutting another inch, not even for a sovereign, although he later admitted that he did not believe either man was in immediate danger. Cash carried on working, and Asprey returned to his own place. Around 15 or 20 minutes later, Asprey heard what he described as a fizzing noise, and in that moment he understood that the water had broken through. The remaining barrier of coal gave way, releasing the contents of the abandoned workings into the active mine. Men further along the underground roads heard a roaring sound moving through the pit, and within moments the water was surging through the colliery like a torrent. Thomas Davies was working near the bottom of the shaft when he heard the noise. He ran towards the main roadway and found that the flood was already upon him, but he managed to reach the shaft and became the last man to be picked up. While the cage moved up and down, he was forced to keep his head above the rising water, and by the time he reached the surface, the water had reached the roof of the inset. Among others caught by the flood was Michael Cash's 19-year-old son Isaac. Isaac was working in the part of the mine known as Jigger Hill when someone called for the men to run. He reached the main gate, but the strength of the current swept him along, and at times, he was completely beneath the water. Only the previous day, Isaac had visited the heading where his father was working. The roof had been dry, although water lay across the floor, and he'd seen water dripping underground before, sometimes falling from the roof like rain. However, he'd never seen a stream breaking directly through the roof or the coal face, and nothing had led him to believe that his father was working beside a hidden reservoir. At around 9 o'clock, Charles Starkey, the colliery manager, came to the pit bank for his snap. He'd managed the mine for about 9 months, and just as he arrived, someone shouted for the cage to be pulled up. When the cage reached the surface, 2 men were found clinging to the top of it. The cage was lowered again, this time carrying Starkey and 2 other men, and together they managed to bring out 9 more miners, including 2 of Starkey's own sons. By that stage, the water in the shaft had already risen to a depth of 7 or 8 feet, Once the survivors had been counted, it became clear that 22 men and boys remained somewhere inside the flooded mine. Nobody above the ground knew whether those missing had drowned immediately, become buried beneath debris, or managed to reach higher sections of the workings. The only possible course was to lower the water level and attempt to reopen a route towards them. What followed was an exhausting recovery operation which continued through cold, wet November days and long nights of darkness. Engines, pumps and boilers were brought in from surrounding works and collieries, and the machinery was kept running continuously. Progress was repeatedly interrupted by breakdowns, damaged pumping equipment and blocked water channels. The flood had torn away roof supports, loosened the ground and washed debris into the gates, while timbers known to the miners as trees had been displaced and sections of the roof had collapsed. Even after the water had begun to fall, the rescuers could not simply walk into the workings. Every single yard had to be examined, cleared and made safe before the men could continue, and in some places an entire shift produced only a few yards of progress. There was also an invisible danger waiting inside the mine. Choke damp had collected in the workings, leaving sections of the pit with too little oxygen to support life, and placing the rescuers themselves in constant danger. During one descent, a man named Ness, he dropped his cap and a tool he was using into the water. When he bent down to retrieve them, he breathed in gas rising through the shaft and almost collapsed, but Starkey grabbed him and signalled for the cage to be raised. Earlier that same day, Ness had reportedly saved Starkey from a similar fate. The water had fallen low enough for Starkey to consider entering one section of the workings, but Ness pulled him back and reminded him of the choke damp, which reports believe would have almost certainly have killed him. Air troughs were placed inside the mine to force fresher air towards the men, while teams of rescuers worked in relays to clear the gates. However, even with those measures in place, the work remained desperately slow and obviously dangerous. By almost 3 o'clock one morning, engineers and officials were still gathered inside the colliery office. The room was bare and unplastered, with cold wind passing through the gaps between the bricks, and although a fire had been lit, it did very little to relieve the discomfort of those who had been awake for so long. Rough plank benches were occupied by exhausted men, while others remained standing because there was nowhere left to sit. Whenever someone rose and left, another person immediately took his place, and before long, sleep overcame many of the men. The sleep was uneasy and frequently disturbed, taken in uncomfortable positions on hard wooden forms while the machinery continued to work outside. Eventually, a cold grey dawn entered through the windows and marked the beginning of the 5th day of the recovery. Fires were kept burning on the pit bank throughout the night and into the early morning. The light helped those involved in the work and also showed travellers where the colliery stood in the darkness. Reports described the workers moving back and forwards through the mist and smoke, their shadows stretched by the flames until they appeared like unearthly figures crossing a barren landscape. Anyone arriving by train had to cross Pelsall Common before reaching the colliery. The route passed the church and continued across 2 fields, which had already been crossed by thousands of visitors. After days of rain, the ground had become a deep mixture of clay and mud. The newspapers warned that anyone who lost the proper path in darkness might find himself falling into one of the old swanks, or one of the hollows scattered across the common. The morning scene at the pit bank was described as one that would remain in the memory of everyone who witnessed it. Beneath a dull, leaden November sky, families who had waited throughout the night remained in silent expectation, still watching for men who would never return. Morgan and Starkey were described by one newspaper as having aged 10 years in as many days, which gives you some sense of the strain under which they were working as the recovery continued. News of the disaster brought visitors from across the surrounding district. Clergymen addressed the crowds, collections were taken for the bereaved, and volunteers provided food, warmth and practical assistance to those who gathered near the pit. Now I've got a feature video coming on Sister Dora. She was a well-known nurse from Warsaw. She was called to Pelsall while there was still some hope that survivors might be brought out. The arrival of Sister Dora briefly revived the spirits of some of the waiting families, because they believed that if Sister Dora had been summoned, rescuers must believe that living men were about to be found. She inspected the arrangements made for possible survivors, visited relatives at the hotel and called upon families in their homes. On arrival at one cottage, a lady broke down in tears, while another family member said to Sister Dora, "No, please let her cry. She's been unable to since the disaster." A schoolroom was prepared in case it was needed to receive the dead, and the hope of finding survivors began to give way to the practical preparations required for the recovery of bodies. The The first clear sign of Thomas Starkey came in a disturbing form. A piece of torn clothing was brought up by the pumping machinery and was about to be discarded when a man named Brownell suggested it should be examined. Inside the cloth was a watch belonging to Starkey, badly damaged, probably by the rods of the pumps. Its discovery led the men to believe that his body could not be far from the bottom of the engine shaft. The tank was stopped and Abraham Lindup, John Buff and John Rounds descended to search. They found the body and brought it up to the surface, where Starkey's younger brother, Charles, who was about 17 years old, was waiting with another brother and their uncle, while the father remained inside the colliery office. The injuries described in reports were severe. Starkey's jaw and thigh were fractured, while the fingers of his right hand had been badly damaged by the pumping machinery, and his body was placed in a box near the engine shaft until it could be moved. The search then continued towards Michael Cash's heading. The rescuers were once again held back by choke damp, but one of the men eventually saw Cash lying behind an overturned coal tub. The flood appeared to have driven a horse and the tub into the roadway ahead of him. Cash was found upon his knees with one arm wrapped around one roof support and the other wrapped around another, while nearby the horse lay entangled in its own harness. There was bruising around Cash's eye, and the position of his body suggested that he'd been thrown or driven with considerable force against one of the timbers. His body was so deeply embedded in the debris that freeing him became long and difficult. Above ground, the number of spectators increased as the news of the discovery spread. The cage descended while the crowd pressed against the barriers around the shaft, and every time it returned, people watched in silence, expecting Cash to be brought up. When the pit gong finally sounded, the cage rose with what the reporter called its mournful load. Cash's body had been wrapped in a blanket and placed upon a makeshift stretcher, while the men who had worked to recover him stood around the body like pallbearers. Reports said that it was Cash's hand who had delivered the fatal blow, bringing destruction upon himself and upon the men who had been working around him. His body was then taken to the station inn. Another party later descended towards the underground stables, where they discovered Thomas Coleman inside one of the stalls. At almost the same time, Coleman's mother arrived at the colliery office. Tea and coffee had been supplied to the engineers and workers, and she was invited inside to warm herself up. She replied that she wanted neither food nor drink, because all she wanted was a boy, so that she might lay out his lifeless body. Clasping her hands together and looking upwards, she asked that a prayer should be heard, apparently unaware that at almost that exact moment her son had already been found. The first inquest was held at the station inn by the coroner W.H. Phillips. It concerned the bodies of Thomas Starkey, aged 19, Michael Cash, aged 46, and Thomas Coleman, aged just 16. The bodies were laid out in a large room adjoining the public house. The long tables had been arranged along the sides of the room, with Starkey placed on one side and Coleman at his feet, Cash lying on the other table opposite him. Cash had a bruise above his eye, believed to have been caused when he struck one of the roof supports around which his arms had been found. Coleman had bruising to his forehead, possibly caused when he heard the water entering the mine and struck his head against the low roof of the stable. The newspaper concluded that Cash and Coleman had drowned, and suggested that the deaths had been sudden and almost painless. That was the interpretation made after the bodies were examined, and it could not reveal with certainty what either man had experienced in his final moments. The most harrowing discovery was still to come. At around 5 o'clock, a party searching along the main gate reached the upper section of the workings, approximately 100 yards from the bottom of the shaft. There they found the rest of the victims gathered together. 10 of the bodies were lying upon the backs. 4 men were sitting inside one coal tub, while there was 3 more inside another. An older member of the Starkey family was found with his legs still inside the tub. One man's clothes were saturated, showing that he'd passed through the floodwater before reaching the place of refuge, but the clothing on the others were completely dry. The water itself had never reached the place where they'd showered. Some of the men were found with their hands clasped, while their arms linked together, even the collars of the shirts turned up, suggesting that they gathered closely while they waited in darkness, perhaps seeking warmth, reassurance, or simple human contact. A reporter from the Birmingham News was later taken underground and shown the place where the bodies had been found. He descended by cage into what he described as thick darkness and followed the miners through the roadway made difficult by falling debris. One of the men guiding him had relatives among the dead and had to be persuaded to continue. After a pause, they each took a candle and went forward. The roadway itself was rough and partially blocked, although the roof was higher than the reporter had expected. As they went deeper, they met men who had already spent hours working in the darkness. One miner stretched a candle into the blackness and told the reporter that the bodies were there. At first, the reporter couldn't see them, but gradually the shapes emerged in the dim light. There were 2 coal tubs, each containing several bodies, with others lying on the ground around them. One man was still kneeling in what appeared to be an attitude of prayer, with his hands resting across the shoulders of another victim below him. The others lay closely together, and their faces appeared calm to the reporter, although the expression of a body cannot provide reliable evidence of whether death was peaceful. At the end of one tub lay an older Starkey, who appeared to have remained behind, while others moved further upwards. Nearby was the body of a boy whose face the reporter believed carried a trace of a smile. The scene suggested that those men had not drowned in the final refuge. Instead, they'd probably been overcome by carbonic acid gas, which was the term then used for a dangerous concentration of carbon dioxide in air depleted of oxygen. The reporter believed that some of them might have remained alive for 3 or 4 days. He also suggested that a tube lowered from the surface might have supplied them with air and saved them, although that was an opinion formed after the disaster and cannot be now proved. What can be said with certainty is that those men survived the original flood, reached one of the highest and driest parts of the colliery, gathered together and waited while the pumps worked above them. The water didn't reach them, but the air couldn't sustain them long enough for the rescuers to arrive. 21 bodies were eventually recovered from the mine, but one victim was never found. The memorial erected in Pelsall churchyard includes the name William Richards. The official inspector's records appear to have described the final victim simply as unknown and not recovered. The inquest then turned towards the cause of the disaster and whether those responsible for the mine should have known about the abandoned workings that were there. Charles Starkey told the coroner that there had been no unusual quantity of water in the mine earlier that morning. He knew of no old workings nearby, and had never received any warning that the colliery was in danger. He had not taken part in some of the later descents because of his father. His son and his cousins were all still underground. He had not taken part in some of the later descents because his father, his son and his cousin were all still underground. By the time he gave evidence, his son's body had been recovered. Mr. North was the mine's surveyor. He said that he'd always understood the colliery to be working in maiden ground. His assistant had examined and surveyed the workings on the day before the accident, and had found nothing which suggested the presence of old mines. The lease covered 61 acres, and the owners believed they still had hundreds of yards of untouched coal before reaching the boundary. Only after the disaster did stories of earlier mining begin to emerge. One elderly man, said to be 90 years old, recalled being told in his youth that old pits had once existed in the area. A member of the jury responded that there had been no need to consult with such an elderly witness, because he himself had seen old pit banks upon neighbouring land. When the flooded heading was finally examined, the explanation became clear. Michael Cash's roadway had broken through at right angles into an old gate road, which had been completely filled with water. Around 3 yards of the barrier had been blown away. Pieces of old timber had been washed from the abandoned workings into the active mine. Starkey, one of the owners, had worked in collieries for 39 years. He said that he'd always believed Pelsall Hall to be a maiden mine, and had no idea that workings lay near the boundary. His father and nephew were still underground while he gave evidence, and he'd also gone below himself and helped recover Michael Cash. The official conclusion was that the disaster could not reasonably have been foreseen. Given the information and plans available at the time, the jury found no grounds upon which to attach criminal blame to the owners or management. That conclusion didn't remove the wider danger revealed by the disaster. Old workings had been abandoned beneath the landscape without reliable plans, leaving later generations of miners unaware of what lay beyond the coal they were cutting. At Pelsall Hall, an underground reservoir remained hidden behind a wall of coal until Michael Cash's pick opened a path into it. The disaster left widows and dozens of children. A meeting was held at the station inn to organise a relief fund, and a committee was formed from local representatives and colliery owners from across Staffordshire. During the meeting, one speaker declared that the children of the dead miners should now be regarded as the children of coal masters. Donations arrived quickly. The first subscriptions made to between £500 and £600, while J.R. McLean, a Member of Parliament, gave a further £500. Food and provisions were also supplied to the families who had waited beside the pit throughout the long recovery. The victims were later carried through Pelsall in a large funeral procession towards St Michael's and All Angels Church. Most of the recovered bodies were buried together in a communal vault within the churchyard. John Hubbard was buried separately at Aldridge, while the missing miner had no recovered remains placed beneath the ground. A memorial was later raised above the communal ground, this one that you can see right here. It records the name of 22 men and boys, and describes the sudden and disastrous inundation of Pelsall Hall Colliery. Today, the ground upon which the colliery once stood gives very little indication of what happened here. The shafts, engines and buildings have disappeared, and the underground roadways remain hidden beneath this landscape. The clearest surviving connection to the disaster stands in the churchyard, where the memorial remembers the men who were killed by the water, the men who survived the flood but died in the poisoned atmosphere, and the families who waited beneath a grey November sky, while fires burned through the night and pumps continued to work. The disaster is sometimes described simply as the drowning of 22 men, but the truth was far more complicated. Some of the men were caught by the torrent, while others escaped into the upper workings. They sat in cold tubs, lay upon the ground, held one another's hands and waited in darkness while rescuers fought to reach them. The water didn't rise high enough to take those final men, but the air slowly failed them before the rescue teams could break through. 22 men and boys went underground at Pelsall Hall Colliery on the morning of the 14th of November 1872, and none of them came home. So rest in peace, the boys.